On the contrary, when we repair a fallopian tube which is closed by infection, when we graft a new one, when we suppress an infection which was blocking the process, then we are acting as an adiutorium naturae, a help to nature. And that is a typical function of medicine, no matter how complex this function is, how sophisticated are the means. It's not the technicalities which involve, it's really whether we are replacing one person by another person and then rupturing the marriage bond, or whether we are helping nature and then being exactly the servant of nature. To make you understand that, I would quote a very curious exclamation made by a woman. It was around 10 years ago, and it was one of the first in vitro fertilization in France, and it is published in the book of Monsieur Testard. And he said that in one of the first in vitro fertilization, after the embryo had been in the incubator for a few days, it was implanted delicately inside the womb of her own mother. I say her mother because an embryo should be more precious to geneticists than a sheep is to a sailor. And the sailor said about his sheep, she is a good sheep. So we would say about an embryo, she is a nice embryo. Well, nevertheless, it was replaced inside the uterus, and at that moment they had some music to soften the atmosphere. And the gynecologist said to the mother, Madame, vous êtes enceinte. Lady, you are pregnant. Which was the correct description. And then they went out, there were 3 of them, and they went out, and then the husband came rather anxious, and he asked to his wife how it happened. And she had this extraordinary phrase, I made love with the all 3. It is an extraordinary expression that only a woman could invent, because it's extremely realist, I should say it's extremely super realist, because how to describe to her husband that 3 technicians united to put a baby inside her womb without telling him, I've made love with all the 3. Well, evidently, they were perfectly correct, those doctors, but she was precisely describing what theoreticians would call substitutio personarum. So it's not necessary to be a moralist to understand the whole thing. It's better to be a woman who feels the truth instead of a man who tries to discover it. Now, whether the respect of the embryo is not at some disadvantage with those techniques. Obviously it is. And I understood that very well one day. It was in Hiroshima, near Hiroshima. I was giving a talk to little sisters. There were 12 of them, and they had a big school with 2,000 girls, Japanese girls, but the sister, part of them were coming from France, and one of them was French, so that she could translate in Japanese what I was saying. And they had asked me to give them a little briefing about what was fecundation, in vitro fertilization, so that they could explain all those things to their pupils. And I tried to explain it very simply, and I said spontaneously about the sexual organ of the female that it was a kind of secret temple in which the tiny baby was blossoming progressively. And at that moment I was interrupted by the Mère Supérieure, superior mother, the mother superior. And she said something in Japanese, which I could not understand. And then we continued. At the end, the little sister who was doing the translation told me, you know what the mother told me? But I said, no. Well, she asked me whether you really were speaking Japanese. And I said, why she has said that? Well, she said, because I translated what you said about this secret temple. And in Japanese, the uterus is written with two kanji. One is shi and the other is kyu. Uterus is shi-kyu. That's a scientific name. Now, shi means a palace and kyu means infant. And it is really marvelous that anatomists of Japan, when they tried to describe what was this little marsupial, so to speak, where the baby would develop, they invented the temple of the child. And probably, when I thought about that, I had the impression that Japanese anatomists were better than we are, because maybe, I would say certainly, the shi-kyu, that is the temple inside the woman, is surely a place which is more dignified than a test tube for the beginning of a being which is directly bound to eternity. We should respect the embryos just because they are a member of our species, but some people have proposed that we should consider them as some experimental material. And I remember 12 years ago, it was in England, in the Parliament, I had to testify because they were beginning a campaign to have the right to use human embryos up to the 14th day as experimental material. At that time, they were saying that they would cure cystic fibrosis of pancreas, which is a very bad disease of which baby can die. They would cure muscular dystrophy, trisomy 21, and hemophilia. They took those examples, if they were allowed to play with human embryos less than 14 days. And when I testified in the Parliament, the British Parliament, I was obliged to tell them that it was not true. Because you cannot study the muscle in an embryo of 14 days, because the muscle will appear after the 18th day. You cannot study the blood, because the blood will happens at the 20th day. And you could not study the brain, because the brain will happens 1 week later. Then they could not make the experiments they were pretending to do on human embryos of less than 14 days. That was very badly received. Next week, the scientific paper Nature published an article, the title of which was marvelous. It was French Influence in Britain. That was really the top scandal, you know. And they proposed a free subscription to Nature to any scientist who would send to them a protocol of an experiment who would show that I was wrong. There is now more than 10 years, and I can tell you nobody received freely this interesting publication, because they have not published any paper showing that I was wrong, because they were wrong.